When I was in graduate school in Chicago, when I was 5, but anyway, when I was there at the Meadville Theological School and the University of Chicago Divinity School, there was a corner bar named Jimmy's that a lot of students frequented. I've gone back and there's no longer a Jimmy's. There is a Starbucks, but it's not quite the same. Anyway, some of the graffiti in the bathrooms were among the most thought-provoking I had ever seen. For example, those of you who've studied a little philosophy will remember that Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Well, there was a graffito in the bathroom stall that said simply, "Is the examined life worth living?" Speaking of Socrates, he had a student named Plato, who in turn had a student named Aristotle. Plato tended to believe the world as we know it is an imperfect shadow of real essences. The idea or form of a table is more real than the imperfect examples of the tables we eat off of, he said. Plato's student Aristotle, on the other hand, thought the things we see are real, and the abstract ideas or forms of them that we hold in our minds are just derivations. So for Plato, being was more real than doing, while for Aristotle, doing was more real than being. Thus, the other graffito I liked in the bathroom of Jimmy's Bar and Grill: "To be is to do," Plato; "to do is to be," Aristotle; "dooby-dooby-doo," Sinatra. I actually got a version of that as a t-shirt, although it has Socrates as "to do is to be," which is incorrect, I think, but to do is to be is to do, and dooby-dooby-doo. This was the closest I could get. And I know I haven't done justice to Plato or Aristotle, and probably not to Frank Sinatra either. But I'd like to pose these questions. Is being more important than doing, or is what we do more important than who or what we are? And the second question, do our deeds flow out of who we are, or do we find out who we are by looking at what we do? There was a cartoon in the Wall Street Journal once that had a minister in the pulpit saying, "In compliance with federal full disclosure laws, I'm required to tell you that I'm not really sure about any of this stuff." And I need to say that to you. I'm not really sure about any of this stuff, but I'm going to try anyway. And if you don't come to the same answers I do, maybe you'll at least have fun running with the questions. So the first thing I'd like to say about being and doing, and here I'm vastly oversimplifying, but in general, Eastern religions tend to emphasize being. Now, they still give you commandments to follow, of course, and things to do or not to do, but those are for the purpose of perfecting your being and becoming enlightened. Recognizing your Buddha nature if you're a Buddhist, or seeing your Godhead if you're a Hindu, that sort of thing. Western religions, on the other hand, and by Western I'm thinking of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam mostly, tend to emphasize doing over being. They still talk about your being as a creature of God, but they emphasize what you must do either in deeds or as an act of faith in order to go to heaven. And when you get to heaven, you don't get to become a pure being or anything like that. You're still kind of a mundane human soul. Now, in general conversation, we sometimes use the words being and doing interchangeably. For example, we say, "Be good," but what we really mean is, "Don't do anything wrong." Or we say, "How are you doing?" and what we really mean is, "How are you?" Still, being and doing pose an interesting question. Is my goal in life to be a particular kind of person, or is it to do particular things? What first made me think about this question was a passage I read in a book on Eastern philosophy. I don't have the exact quote anymore, but it went something like this: "If you want to do a certain thing, then learn to become a certain kind of person. When you become that person, it will no longer be necessary to do that certain thing." I've thought a lot about that, and I've often wondered, is the way to do the right thing to become the right kind of person, and then the right thing will simply follow? Does doing, in other words, flow out of being? If so, then maybe instead of making a to-do list, we would be better making up a to-be list. Now, every once in a while, I've seen evidence to that effect, and here's an example of a negative version of being affecting doing. Some of you may recall a study that was done at Stanford in 1971 by Philip Zimbardo. He wanted to better understand prisons and their effect on not just the prisoners, but on the staff, the guards. So he and his colleagues set up an experiment with volunteers, mostly college students, who had never been inside a prison before. And they set up the basement of the psychology department to look like a realistic prison. And they also had guard uniforms and prisoner clothing. They randomly assigned their subjects to the role of guard or prisoner with a flip of a coin. And then they gave the guards job descriptions, and they told the prisoners that sometime in the next week they would be picked up by a police car in the middle of the night. They'd be handcuffed and then taken to the prison in the psychology building, where they'd be photographed, fingerprinted, given prison outfits to wear, and put behind bars. Now, for the first day or two, everyone was kind of having a good time with this. It's a make-believe thing. But eventually, what started out as kidding began to get serious. The students who had been assigned to be guards started doing degrading things to their prisoners, and the prisoners began to break down. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks, but they had to stop it after 6 days because of the harm it was doing to the students. In this case, being in a certain role, even if make-believe, seemed to have quite an effect on the behavior that flowed from that role. And then, of course, here's a positive example from a teacher named Hannah McCarty, who worked in the early 60s with a group of 8th and 9th graders. In the early 1960s in New York City, he writes, I worked with a group of students who were only reading at the 2nd to 3rd grade level. I tried to tutor them in small groups and one-on-one, but I must confess the results were not encouraging with most. One of my problems was the fact that almost no age-appropriate remedial reading materials were available for junior high school students at such a low level. They wanted to read about relationships, dating, sports, and cars, not materials like run, spot, run, see the ball, it is bouncing. A glimmer of an idea crept into my mind. I wrote a proposal for funding a little tutoring project. We didn't get a huge sum of money, but it was enough for a pilot program for the last 6 months of the school year. It was simple, and it worked. I hired my students as reading tutors. I told them that the nearby elementary school had students in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grades who needed help in reading. I had some money that I could pay anyone who'd help me work with these children. My students asked whether this would take place during or after school. Oh, during school. In fact, it'll be instead of our class period together. We'll just walk over there every day and work with the kids there. But you've got to know that if you don't show up, you don't get paid, and you also have to understand that it would be very disappointing to a young child if you were his or her tutor and you didn't work caringly with that child. You have a big responsibility. All but one of my 11 students jumped at the chance to be part of this program. The lone holdout changed his mind within a week as he heard from the other students about how they were enjoying working with the young kids. The elementary kids were grateful for the help, but even more so for some attention from these older kids from their own neighborhood. Clearly, you could see a version of hero worship in their eyes. Each of my students was assigned 2 or 3 younger children to work with, and they worked, reading to them and having them read aloud as well. My goal was to find a way to legitimize 8th and 9th graders reading such young material. I thought that if I could get them to read that material and read regularly, they would surely improve. As it turned out, I was right. At the end of that year, testing showed almost all of them had improved 1, 2, or even 3 grade levels in reading. But the most spectacular changes were in my students' attitudes and behavior. I hadn't expected that they would start to dress better, with more care and more neatness, nor had I expected that the number of fights would decrease while their attendance dramatically increased. One morning, as I was entering school from the parking area, I saw Jose walking toward the door. He looked ill. "What's the matter, Jose?" I said. "You look like you might have a fever." This was a student whose attendance had been the second worst in the group before. "Oh, I guess I'm feeling kind of sick, Mr. McCarty," he said. "So why are you here today? Why didn't you stay home?" I asked. His answer floored me. "Oh man, I couldn't miss today. I'm a teacher. My students would miss me, wouldn't they?" He grinned and went in the building. What's interesting to me about this story is that in order to get his students to do something, that is, to improve their reading, Mr. McCarty got each of them to be something, a teacher. Once they were teachers, certain responsibilities flowed from that. He got them to do by having them be. An interesting cinematic version of this was the movie Tootsie. Any of you see that years ago with Dustin Hoffman? All right. He played an out-of-work actor trying to get a role for a TV soap opera. The executives are not looking for a man, though, so he dresses up like a woman and lands a part that eventually makes him famous. But he finds as he interacts with the women and men how much sex roles both create opportunities and limit them. And he learns firsthand what it's like to be perceived as a woman in a male-centered world. And he gains compassion and insight. And near the end of the movie, he says, "I was a better man as a woman than I ever was as a man." Being something different from what he had always been changed the way he acted, what he did, what he said. Though you could also argue that what he did changed who he was. There's a Jewish story about a baker named Jacob. He has a lot of stories, this Jacob. And he was a baker named Jacob. He was known in the community for his goodness and his wisdom. And a rich man once came to him for advice and say, "What must I do to attain freedom?" And Jacob said, "You must learn to give your money away." Why? Because this is the way to freedom. The rich man was astonished. "But how does giving my money away bring about my freedom?" And Jacob said, "Either the key to your wallet is in your heart, or the key to your heart is in your wallet. You must teach your heart to grow, to reach out and to give, for unless you express your generosity, you'll be locked inside your greed and never learn to love." And then he added, "For you see, you can give without loving, but you cannot love without giving." Robert Fulghum, Unitarian minister and author, said something along those lines in his book, Words I Wish I Wrote. And he said here, "The older I get, the less attention I pay to what people say or think or hope. I notice what they do, how they live, and what they work for. If you are not engaged in the sweaty work of the world, you should not be in charge of the deodorant concession." Knowing and understanding and being are not enough. One must do. To gain the world and give nothing to it is to lose your soul. To be what you want to be takes action on your part. I wish I were a kinder person. Start doing kind things. I wish I were more generous. Start giving your treasure away. I wish I were less self-centered. Start looking out for others. To be what you want to be, start doing things that the kind of person you would like to be would do. That is how you become that person. And that is how you stay that person. Consider the great songwriter Irving Berlin. During his life, he wrote almost 1,000 songs, and most people are familiar with God Bless America and I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas. But he never stopped writing songs, and he once said near the end of his life, "The question is, are you going to be a crabby old man, or are you going to write another song?" He understood that to be is to do, and to do is to be. If I stop writing songs, he realized, I'll become something I don't want to be. To be who I am means to do what I do. I don't know if this will help you, but I like to think of our lives as a triangle with 3 points. To be, to do, and to have. Who we are, our being, influences what we do, and what we do tells the world who we are. Likewise, what we do will often determine what we have, and what we have changes what we might have done if we hadn't had it. What we have also influences who we are. If you own a lot of things, for example, they may restrain you from being the kind of person you might otherwise be. The more you have, the more you need to guard it. To be, to do, to have. 3 different ways to look at our lives, but all intertwined. Intertwined to the point that if you change one, you change the other 2 as well, so that you become part of that interdependent web as applied to human beings. And incidentally, sometimes what we do speaks so loudly that people don't even have to figure out who we are. There was a minister named Carl Lutz, a white person, who went as a young pastor to an all-black congregation in Muskogee, Oklahoma, when he was still single. And the response of the parishioners was friendly enough, but not overwhelming. But then Carl married Esther, a white woman. And even though both of them were white, church attendance by the African-American townspeople suddenly increased, and markedly. At a loss for an explanation, Carl asked one of the elders, "My sermons can't have gotten that much better, can they?" And the elder agreed, but he said, it's due to your new wife. But Carl said, "Previous pastors have also had wives." "Oh yes," said the elder, "but those wives went to white churches when they received communion." Sometimes what you do says so much about who you are that it's not necessary to utter a word. You know that expression, "the proof is in the pudding"? Well, it works if you spell pudding with a T as well. The proof is in the pudding. It's where you put your life, put your money, where your mouth is, we might say. Put your life on the line. Put up or shut up. The proof is in the pudding. And sometimes our pudding clashes with our being, or at least the being we thought we were. Here's something from another teacher, Marna Irby, who said, "I was walking across the schoolyard with my 2nd grade daughter and a little pupil in tow. And I was pleased when the little pupil said, 'You're the best teacher there is. I wish you were my mommy.' Before I could speak, my small daughter blurted out, 'You can have her. She's not so great at home.'" I was crushed. "Why did you say that?" I asked. "Because," my daughter replied, "you're always smiling and pretty at school. At home, you're too busy or too tired." I was forced to see myself through the eyes of my child, and I didn't like what I saw. I promised that day that I would turn my life around, saving some of my best self for those nearest and dearest to me. I may not always succeed, but at least now I am more aware of my priorities. When what we do is not consistent with who we think we are, it's like a slap in the face to be forced to see it. But it can also change our lives if we're willing to let it. In the realm of being and doing, I think it really is true that to be is to do, and to do is to be, and it flows back and forth in such an intricate way that we are left with a spiral of being to doing to being to doing to being, and we're all left singing, "Doobie doobie doo, be doobie doobie, doobie doobie doo, be doobie doobie. It turned out so right for strangers in the night."